Hello and welcome to day 9 of our Cloud One series. Today we are going to look at accessing private services from our Cloud One application. Now, we are only going to focus on Cloud SQL, right? We can look at memory store, but for now we only make the focus Cloud SQL, right? To connect to your Cloud SQL database, you have two options. You can either use public IPs or you can use private IPs, right? Now, when you use public IP, basically what you're saying is that this application should be accessible through the public internet. So that basically opens up your application for people to then try to hack their way through by, let's say, trying to guess, you know, the databases, trying to find out what are the users, trying to find out the passwords, because you basically have your database application as a public service, right? Now, a way around this to make sure that your application is secure is to basically use private services access with Google Cloud SQL, right? Now, your Google Cloud SQL database does not actually live in your VPC, right? So it lives in a network that is managed by Google, right? And so what we want to basically say is, hey, Google, allow us to be able to connect to our database through my VPC, right? So peering, you are just establishing a connection between your VPC and then Google Cloud's VPC, right? So that is what we basically want to do. This would then allow us to privately connect to our Cloud SQL instance without exposing a public IP, right? And so in the end, what we'll have is we'll basically have our Cloud Run service, which would then be using direct VPC egress, right? And this will connect through private services access or some VPC peering connection to Cloud SQL. So we have a connection that is secure, right? And free from, any prying eyes. To demonstrate this, I've basically set up an application and we are going to use that to demonstrate this, right? Some prerequisites you might need to make sure that you have before you try out something like this is one, you need to make sure that you attach a custom service account to your Cloud Run service, right? This is required whether you are doing something like this or not to make sure that your Cloud Run service only has access to resources that you declare. So we will just look at our IAM section. So this is where I basically created this demo service account, and the access I gave to it is only Cloud SQL clients, right? This is for something else, but the access you will need in this situation, the Cloud SQL client. So this will basically allow your application, which is going to use the service account credentials, to be able to access Cloud SQL. The next thing you will need is to give it the role. So we've given it that role, and you would also need to create secrets for your password and the user for the database. So that is where basically you can come to your secret manager and then you can create, the passwords for the database and then also the password for the user account, right? You will probably do this after you have created the database, right? But I'm just talking about it here beforehand. So you go ahead to create your secret. So this could even include the instance connection name, the database name itself, right? But I kept it simple by only placing the database password and then the database user. So based on your requirements, you could actually keep the database name also here in secret. So once you set up your secrets, right, for the database user and then the database password, you need to make sure that you go to the permissions and you basically allow or you grant access for your service account. So in this case, you can see this is my service account. So I would just need to copy the service account email right here. And then you would kind of select the secret that you have created. And then you click on grant access and you go ahead to basically enter that principal name and then you select a row. So in this case, the row that you need is just secret manager, secret assessor. So this would just allow your service account to be able to read the value of the secret. That is the only row that your service account needs, right? Generally, you can go ahead to give your service account a broad role on the project by coming here and then giving it the role of secret manager, secret assessor. But what that does is it allows that service account to access any secret in your application or in your project. And that is not what you might want, right? You might want to make sure that the service account only has access to what it needs. So in that case, you can ignore adding a global secret accessor permission here, but instead you go to that service, to that secret, and then you go to the permissions and you add that permission directly here. So that means that this service account will only have access to this particular secret and not all secrets in your project, right? So you do that for all the secrets that you would add. So if you added maybe the DB name and stuff like that, you go ahead to add them in your secrets, right? So once we are done with that, we need to create our VPC if you don't have any, right? So if you don't have a VPC where you will have to or you want to deploy your Cloud Run application, because remember we want to connect our Cloud Run application through direct VPC egress into our network, right? So that we can also connect the database to that same network and they can communicate with each other. So in this situation, you would need to create a VPC if you have not. So I have a demo VPC here, and I only have one subnet, which is going to be where my Cloud Run services is going to be. I just have a /24 range, which should be enough with around over 250 IPs. That should be enough for my Cloud Run service, right? If I'm scaling to, let's just say, because you are looking at something around the range of like times 4, right? So let's say if I am scaling to 10, then I'm looking at, let's say 40, right? 40, if I'm scaling to times 10, then I'm looking at, let's say, about 40 of them, right? The reason I mentioned 4 IPs is because at the moment, right, your Cloud Run service needs 2 IPs in order to function. But at the same time, for 20 minutes after the service shuts down, it will still retain those 2 IPs. So for those 20 minutes, if you have, let's say, 4 services already running, and then you are relaunching new services, or you are maybe updating the service, then whilst it's shutting down, the four services will retain their IP for 20 minutes, and then also the new services coming up or the new instances coming up will also need uh, 2 new IPs each, right? So you can basically provision something that has enough IPs to satisfy your use case, but this should be enough for this demo. So I have this subnet here that I have created, right? Now we need to look at the Cloud SQL instance. So I would assume that you already have a Cloud SQL instance, but in my use case, what I've done is just to provision a very small Cloud SQL instance just to demo. So I have a very small Cloud SQL instance right here. And so if I then go into the instance, so if you wanted to create a new one, right, then you can come to your Cloud SQL console, click on create instance, select, the database engine, in my case, MySQL. And then in my case, I just wanted something small. I didn't want Enterprise Plus. I just want something small for testing. So I just went ahead for Enterprise, and then I just selected the sandbox version for something very small. You give it a name, you generate a password. So this is where you can then store this password in your secret. So this is the password that when I created the instance, I basically stored it inside this secret, so the contact DB pass, right? So you would then store your password inside this secret, and you make sure that you configure it in a region where your application is also going to be to minimize the latency, right? And you can specify some other configurations. For now, I just started the application with public IP to demonstrate that the application can still work with public IP. but we will later on change to a private IP, right? So yeah, you can configure public IP to get started, or if you already are sure that you want to just start with private IP, then just go ahead to start with a private IP and then go ahead to configure the connection, which we will do in a bit. So let's just go ahead to review our Cloud One application and some of the settings that we have on it. Now, this is the Cloud One service. Once we go to the application and we click on revisions, we can go to the latest revision to see the details. And some few details. So it's running on port 8000, and I have some few environment variables, right? So you can see that for the database name, I just used the database that I created. And so after you create your Cloud SQL instance, you just need to make sure that you go to databases and then you create your database, right? By default, if you do not create a database user for this demo, for the purpose of this demo, it is okay for me to use the root user, but you might want to actually create different user accounts for specific use cases. But for this, the purpose of this demo, I'm just sticking with the root user and then the password that I generated. So you can see here that this is the DB name, and then this is the instance connection name, right? And then there's the DB user, which I've stored inside the secret, and then also the DB pass, which I've stored also inside the secret. So I've provided these as environment variables, right? And then also I have a Cloud SQL connection, right? So I would just try to edit the instance just to show this. So when you are creating a new instance, if you want to basically allow that instance to connect to Cloud SQL, you have to make sure that under Cloud SQL connections, you basically select that SQL instance that you have created, right? So you need to make sure you've created the instance first, and then under Cloud SQL instance, just select that SQL application that you have created. So this would then allow, or this would then basically configure a Cloud SQL proxy, which would then allow your application to directly communicate with your Cloud SQL instance. If you want more information on that, I'll attach these to the notes. But basically, if you want to connect your Cloud One application to your Cloud SQL instance, right, you need to make sure first, of course, you have created the instance, right? And you need to also make sure that you have assigned the appropriate IAM role, which is the Cloud SQL client. Where is this? Yeah. So once you are done with that, you can go ahead to edit the instance, or if you are creating a new instance, then you can just go ahead to make sure that you kind of add that SQL instance to the Cloud SQL connections. So once you are done with that, now to connect to it either through private IP or through public IP, you have the option of using, with TCP. If you are connecting with public IP, you have the option of using, Unix sockets. So depending on the method that you go with, you have different options of kind of connecting to the cloud service, connecting to your Cloud SQL. So you can also connect with Cloud SQL connectors for specific language. So this is what I am basically using, and I have, because the application is written in Python and Flask, and so I have something like this there, which then allows you to basically kind of provide, this environment variable, which then will tell the Cloud SQL connector that, hey, basically just use the private IP instead of the public IP. Else it will by default try to use the public IP, right? So either you use something like the Unix connection, or you can use something like the Cloud SQL language connectors. So Google Cloud basically have these SDKs that you can use, and they are libraries that provide encryption and IAM authorization when you want to connect to your Cloud SQL instance. So this can be a very useful library to use, provided you have these supported languages, right? So you can use this, and then you can basically configure your connection to Cloud SQL, which is what I am using, right? If you're not using that, then you can use something like a Unix socket connection, You can use a unisocket connection. If you are using private IP, then you could also connect through TCP, right? So these are the various methods that you can use to connect to your Cloud SQL instance. So in my case, I selected the Cloud SQL instance and I'm also using the language connector, right? And for now, we are just using the public IP. So the application should work as is. So let's just visit the application to see. Let's come back. Okay, so we have contacts and then we can just create new contacts. So we can have John Doe, some address. So you can basically create new contacts and add them to your application, right? I'll just do this. Just a second. Let me just do that. So let's just wait a second for this to connect. So we have John Doe, some address. We can create these contacts. And so we have their contact created successfully, right? Now we want to establish the private connection from our Cloud Run service to the Cloud SQL instance, right? So we'll go ahead to establish the private connection. First, let us create the direct VPC egress from our Cloud Run service to the VPC. So let us do that. Let us tackle that first. So I'll come to networking and then connect to a VPC for outbound traffic. So this is where you can either select between serverless VPC access connector or the direct VPC egress. So in this case, I'll go to my demo VPC and then I'll select the subnet, right? So you need to make sure the subnet is in the same region as where you deployed your service. So I'll select the subnet. Either we go with firewall rules. I'm not sure how this would work, but let's just try it. Cloud Run. Let's just try it. Let's just try a network tag. I just want to see if this would work. If it doesn't work, we will ignore network tag. And then we want to route, request to private IPs to the VPC. If you choose to route all traffic to the VPC, then you might need to have some cloud NAT in your VPC for outbound traffic. That is, if you need your application to reach outside or through or to the internet, then you might need to have a cloud NAT. But that is only if you are routing all traffic to the VPC. If you are routing all traffic, then that means that any outbound traffic to the internet would also go through the VPC. But that is not what we want. We just want to route only private IPs. So we can go ahead and then deploy a revision of our application. Let's just wait to see that everything works. I was not able to actually test the whole process, so fingers crossed everything should work and we should have no issues. Let's try once more. Okay, yeah, so the application works and that is fine. So we've now established the direct VPC egress. So we now need to go to our Cloud SQL and then establish a connection from Cloud SQL into the VPC. So we can just go to our overview section, or we can go to connections, I think. Can go to connections, can go to networking, and then we can try the public IP. So we try the public IP, we say we want private service access, and then we want it into our demo VPC. So we need to basically set up the private access connection in our demo VPC. So we click on setup connection. This will require us to enable a few APIs. You can select your own range. That is, you can create your own range, right? Or you can allow Google Cloud to automatically create a range for you, which is what we will go with for now, right? But if you wanted more control, then you can create your own IP range and then you can point your application to it. You can point the connection to that allocated IP range. So we will just use automatic for now. And then we'll go ahead to create the connection. So this should be creating the connection right here. So if you come to your VPC and then you click on this right arrow here, you can go to private services access, and you can see that the range is being created or has been created, and the connection is also being established. So it's created the range, the IP range for the connection, and is now establishing the connection. I think that is what is still happening. So this is basically establishing a connection between your VPC and then Google Cloud VPC, where, or the network where they basically host your Cloud SQL instance. It looks like this will take some time. Let's just see something here. Where is that? So let's come to networking. Right, so it's trying to establish the VPC peering. So you can see it here. So the peer network is service networking, from my network to service networking. So it's trying to establish the VPC peering. Let's see, let me refresh once more. Okay, so it's done. So it's basically created a VPC peering between our network and then the network where our Cloud SQL instance is hosted. Let me see something. Maybe this will just help us to see only the peering network. So just for us to just see, so the network, my demo VPC, US Central, where is that? I think I saw it, US Central 1 view. Yeah, so you can see some default route, the default route and the default route to the internet gateway. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So let's go to our VPC networks, and then let's go to the demo VPC. Now we have established the connection between the Cloud Run service and then our Cloud SQL. So they are now connecting through the same network. I think I need to go ahead to save these changes here. So I'll go ahead to save these changes, and I'll disable the public IP. Right. So let's try this. So we have the demo VPC here. And let's see the allocated IP range. So it was using the automatic one, and then let's just save the changes. So we have disabled the instance is being updated. Okay, so it's been updated. So let's just wait for a bit. Let's see if there are any. Okay, so editing. Let's just wait for a while whilst the instance is being updated. Now, another thing we will need to do is, since we are using the language connector, right, which I just basically also use this information. So we will need to set up this environment variable, which would then tell the service to use, or the language connector to basically use the private IP instead of the public IP. So we will need to set up this environment variable, but I want this to complete and us to just try without that environment variable in place and then the public IP disabled, and to see the error that we face. I just want us to try that. So that is why I'm just waiting for this to complete. Okay, so yeah, the process has completed. The instance has been edited. Let's just come to the instance. So the update has finished. Let's go to overview, and we should see now under connections that it now has an internal private IP. So there is no public IP connectivity. So let us go ahead to edit the revision, and then let us provide that environment variable. So private IP, So there's not a secret, so we just add it here, and then let's just say true, right? And let's deploy the new revision. Fingers crossed this works. I've not tested this out, so let's see. Let's see. Go. Okay. Yeah. So it works now, and this is now connecting, or it should be connecting through the private IP, right? I'm not sure what is the issue now. I fully generated this application using AI, so I'm very much aware that there are a couple of issues in the code itself. I just want to see if our connection is being established. That is what I want to just establish for the application errors itself. Let's just deploy a new version just to trigger the the instance that was created to kind of be recreated, right? But this connector, just a few things you would need to note, when you are connecting to the application, to just make sure that the connections aren't being recreated, closing and opening the connection. So those are the bits that are kind of like slowing the application down whilst I was testing, and were just causing crashes here and there. So those are the bits to note. But ideally, once you connect, your private IP through your direct VPC egress, and then you have your Cloud SQL instance and they are communicating with each other, it should then allow you to be able to access the application through the private connection. So I will try again to add something like Sarah Doe, Sam Street, and I'll create the contacts. Yeah, I'm having those SQL connection issues. I'm having those SQL connection issues. Or let's see. Yeah, let's just wait and see if we see any errors. Let's see. This was when 10:17. Okay, so probably let's see here. Let's see here. So SQL was sent perhaps out of memory, out of memory, out of memory. Let me see. Let's see. There should be container memory utilization somewhere around here. I don't think so. We're around 60%. The CPU utilization is also around, let's see. So let us go back to the logs. Let us go back to the logs. Okay, so let's see. So an exception occurred, timeout. So we are having timeout errors. Let's see. Uh, the session shutting down on closed client session. So it's just the client connections that basically keeps on giving me issues. Yeah. Mhm. It's the client connection that keeps on giving issues. Let us try to figure. Da, 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 da. Let's see. Okay, so the issues are mostly due to the application code itself, so it's not due to the connection, because with the connection, when you are using the language connector, you basically just need to specify either you want to use the IP types private or you want to use the IP types public. And we are doing that based on environment variable, right? In our case, we have set that environment variable. So if you recall, we did set that environment variable like private IP is this or private IP is that, right? If you check here, we do have that environment variable set up right here. Right, so this should then tell the language connector to basically use the private IP. So the issue is more or less with the application code itself and then the maintaining the connection. So I did ask Cloud to kind of fix that issue. So it was able to figure out what it was, and it has fixed that issue. So there was some aggressive connection testing, which was causing the invalidate pool error. Right. So hopefully we should not have that issue anymore. Right. So it has fixed that issue and I've basically pushed a new change. So let's just try it out once more to see if that fixes it. Right. But if your application does more memory intensive tasks, then you might consider upgrading to maybe 1 gig of memory. But 512 megabytes should be fine for what we are trying to do, since it's just simple connection to the database and then maintain, you know, the connection. So we can try to create a new contact again. So Sarah Doe, our new address. Right, okay. So it works. So we are able to now connect to our Cloud SQL instance, but now we are basically using the private IP. Right. So we moved from the first phase that we were in, which is using the public IP, which is opening up to everyone. And then we've now moved to this new phase, which now because so the summary is that basically Google Cloud has its own network where your Cloud SQL services are hosted. Right. Now, if you want to connect to your Cloud SQL service, you can use the public IP, which of course is open to the public internet, or you can use a private IP. To connect it to a private IP, you need to have your own VPC, and then you need to create a connection between that Google or that third-party network and your VPC. So you can do that from your VPC directly by coming to the private services access, and then you go ahead to create a new connection, right? But you also need to allocate the IP range for that connection, right? In our case, we just use Cloud SQL to kind of do that provisioning, and then we basically told Google Cloud to, go ahead to automatically assign an IP range. So we didn't need to worry about manually assigning an IP range ourselves. But in an ideal case, in a production scenario where you have multiple clients connecting to the application, you might want to make sure that you have control over the IP range. So in that case, you can basically allocate your own IP range and then use that.